Now we're going to take on one of the most confusing kinds of endgames. Bishops of opposite color. It's well known that often material advantage in this type of position isn't sufficient to win. A lot of the time you can be up a pawn or two, sometimes even three, and your opponent can set up a blockade. For instance, in this position I have a light square bishop, he has a dark square bishop. He can set up a blockade on the dark squares that's impenetrable. If we clear the board for a minute, take a look at this. This is a very simple example. Here, white has 2 pawns extra, but there's absolutely no way to win. Black just moves back and forth, bishop b2 to e5 to d4 to c3. All he has to do is cover the e5 square. There's no way for white to ever dislodge the black king, because it's on a dark square, and the light square bishop can't ever get there. And the dark bishop can just move around, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. White can't make any progress. And there are many variations of this kind of position, of course. So bishop of opposite color endgames are notorious for being drawish. It's very hard to win them. Now we're going to take a look at a couple endgames in which I tried to do that. I reached this position in the Marshall Chess Club in New York, 1993. My opponent was a guy named Eric Moscow, who was actually a very strong young player about 20-25 years ago, who quit chess for many years and came back and started sponsoring events and playing chess again. He's a very good guy, and Eric and I became friends. In this position, I'm up a pawn. I have a 2-to-1 kingside majority, and we have 3 pawns each in the queenside. The most important principle in trying to convert an advantage in bishop of opposite color endgames is the principle of 2 weaknesses. Black has 1 weakness on the king side, my potential passed pawn. I have to provoke a weakness on the queen side, and then I have to create a position where he has a bishop defending 1 weakness on one side, and a king defending the other weakness on the other side. Then I have to go after the bishop, and I have to make sure his king is far enough away that it can't help. The principle of 2 weaknesses is tremendously important in chess, in all positions, middle game positions as well. A lot of the time one guy will be defending the king side, and then the crucial blow will happen on the queen side. He can't switch his defense over fast enough. So as we go through this game, I want you to feel how all of my emphasis is on creating a second weakness. I'm sure you can guess my first move. Bring the king in, king g4. The initial outpost of the king is very important in these types of endgames because a king can't be dislodged by a bishop as long as it's on the opposite color. So if my king, for instance, gets to f5, he can never move it off. If my king gets to e6, he can never push it away. Similarly, if his king gets to f6, the only way I can get rid of it would be to push a pawn to g5 check. Otherwise, it's there for life. I played king g4. He played king g7. And I brought my king to the great square f5. So the first step was to activate my king. He played bishop a3. Do you see his threat? Eric's idea was to play bishop b2, attacking my c3 pawn, which can't be defended, of course. And once it moves, bishop takes d4, even material. I responded to his threat by playing the move c4, which was a little bit unfortunate, but necessary. The reason it wasn't optimal is because I don't want my pawns to be in the same color as my bishop, because first of all, that limits its mobility, and second of all, because he can create a blockade, which is exactly what he wants on the dark squares. When my pawns are on c4 and d5, put his pawns, for instance, on b6 and a5, and his bishop on d6, there's virtually no way to make any progress now. He has a complete blockade on the dark squares, and all he has to do is worry about the king side. His bishop is close enough to be able to help out on the king side. His king can stay on g7. This position is completely drawn. I can't allow it. So this blockade of bishop on d6, pawn on a5, seems very, very hard to break through. In fact, it looks impossible to break through. Later on, he was able to establish this, and we're going to see if I can get through it. After I played c4, he played bishop b2, and I had to play d5. Notice, of course, I couldn't play king e5, because then c5 would be a very strong move. Attacking the pinned piece, it can't move because of my king, and next he'll win the pawn. I had to play d5, but the key is that he doesn't have time to create the blockade that I mentioned. He played the move b6, beginning the blockade. Now I can play king e6 soon. I didn't do it right away, though. It doesn't make much of a difference if my king is on d7 right away. His king will be necessary to defend his king side. I'll have the e6 square later. Notice also, of course, that if he plays the move king f7, he walks into a dangerous pin. I have ideas like c5, and then after he takes it, d6 check. Discovered check. He has to watch out for these ideas. I played the move g4, beginning my kingside expansion. Ideally, I could get a position with pawns on h6 and g5. His king would have to go back and be relegated to the defense of the h7 pawn. His bishop can't defend that. Then I would bring my bishop to attack the h7 pawn, bring my king into the h5 square, for example. I might even sacrifice my bishop. Or maybe I would bring my king to e6. his bishop would be forced to defend the queen's side. The perfect position where we have two weaknesses. He has to balance too much. Even this position might look impenetrable to you, but you'll see how I can get through. I played g4, he played h6. He didn't want to allow his pawn to be frozen on a light square. A good decision. And now I played king e6, an active king. Bishop a3. We know his plan. He's trying to set up a fortress, a defense which is impenetrable. He wants the dark squares to be held, the king to cover the king's side, the bishop to cover the queen's side. I have to try to create the second weakness. I played bishop a4. He played bishop d6. I played h3. No reason to play h4, because then he can really create a blockade. After bishop g3, h5, if he were to ever get his king to g5, I'd have real problems. Complete immobility on the king's side. His defense so far has been very strong, but I still have ideas. King g6. Now at this point I'd have to say that the position should be objectively drawn. I have some good ideas to create an outside pass pawn on the queen's side, but it's not so easy. Of course you see that if I were to ever get my king to the a6 square with his pawn still in a7, then I could win the pawn and things would be very good. But that's not so easy to do. He's inevitably going to play a5, and I have to try to figure out how to get through this position. So take a few moments here. Think about it. Is there any way that you can imagine winning this type of position? Let's look at what I did. I played h4. He played bishop g3, attacking the pawn. I played bishop e8 check, king g7, and I played king d7. So now, of course, he can't take my h4 pawn because I'll take his c7 pawn with my king. Then the passed d pawn will be winning. He doesn't want to give up his defense. He played king f6. Now I played bishop h5. Just waiting. There's no need to rush in this type of position. I have complete control of the board. He doesn't have any counterplay. I just have to set up the optimal attacking position. He played bishop d6. King c6. You might be coming upon my idea. Maybe not. He played king e7. Now I took the chance to create the pass pawn on the king's side. g5. H takes g5. H takes g5. Now, if you remember what I said early on about me not wanting to put my pawns on light squares, about the ideal possible blockading position that black could create, this seems to be it. But there's a problem. Things aren't so easy. I have an idea to create a pass pawn on the queen's side. He played king d8. What would happen if he played the move a5? What did I have in mind? The position looks like a draw, looks like I can't do anything. But here I have a very important tactical idea to create the second pass pawn. I can play the move c5. Now this might look ridiculous because of course the square is defended twice. If he takes with the bishop, then after king takes c7, I have the two pass pawns I wanted. He has two weaknesses. This will be impossible to defend because I want to play g6 and I force either his bishop or his king to defend that one. Say he plays king f6, and then I play d6. He can't deal with both weaknesses. If we were to play bishop d4, defend that pawn, then I can play d6. He can't deal with both. So after c5, he has to take with the b pawn, but then I play king b5. I go straight for the a pawn. He's lost his defender. My next move will be king takes a5, and once again black will have two weaknesses to deal with. The g pawn and the a pawn. This position is winning. The principle of two weaknesses. If he tries to gain counterplay by a move like c4, that's no problem. My bishop can both blockade that pawn and defend my g6 pawn from the c2 square, say. Bishop d1 to c2 is a good maneuver. My king would maneuver to either b5 or b7, depending on what he defends the g7 square with, and then I would simply push my a pawn up the board. There's no way to defend both, not to mention he has to keep an eye on the c7 pawn, because I could create a third passer, the d5 pawn. So we see that his defense isn't quite as easy as it looked. The g pawn is one thing to deal with, either a king or a bishop has to watch it. His a7 weakness is another thing. But if he plays the move a5, then I have this c5 tactic. If he doesn't play a5, and I maneuver my king to b5 and a6, then the position is easily winning, because I take the a7 pawn, and then I can easily create a pass pawn with a 3-2 advantage. How else could he defend? If he tries to play the move bishop e5, then I would play king b5. My next move is king a6, and after he plays a5, I'm sure you see my move, c5, creating a second pass pawn. So logically, if after a5, I'm going to play c5, b takes c5 is bad because of king b5, and bishop takes c5 is bad because of king takes c7, the next step is to think about how to defend the c7 square. the move king d8 comes to mind. So now we see the essence of my attempt to win this position. He needs both his pieces to defend the queen side, and that's when my g-pawn comes into play. After king d8, I played king b5, threatening king a6. He played a5. Now we see that I can't play c5, because bishop takes c5 would make it look pointless. But now I began play on the other side. Remember, the principle of two weaknesses, g6. And we see his problem. The king can't come to the defense, because after king e7, g7, my bishop guards the f7 square. My next move would be to queen, because my pawn controls the f8 square. There's no way to defend. So the only move is to play bishop e5. I'm sure you know what I did now. c5. He played b takes c5. White to move. What do you do? Of course, I don't want to take the c5 pawn. That's useless. The principle of two weaknesses. King takes a5, and now I have two passed pawns. He has a lot to deal with. He played c4. I played bishop f3. My bishop can defend that pawn from the b1 h7 diagonal. He played c3, bishop e4. Now my bishop guards the g6 pawn if his king goes that way, and defends the c2 square. It's very important in this type of endgame, in bishop endgames, to figure out how to maximize the potential of your bishop on one diagonal. The bishop can't defend well on two diagonals. For example, if he were to have a pawn on g3 and c3, this would be an overloaded bishop. g2, followed bishop takes g2, c2 is an easy way to win. Or the reverse, c2 first, bishop takes c2, g2. This would be an overloaded bishop. But a bishop can defend many things along a single diagonal. So my opponent decided to bring his king to the queen side, king c8. I played king b5. Now, of course, you see that logically, it makes sense for me to bring my king to the king side since his king went to the queen side. If my king ever gets to the f7 square, for example, after g7, he'll have to take it. I'll win the bishop, and then win the following endgame. This is actually what happened. But it's a long way. After king b5, he played bishop g7. If you were to play the move king b7, one thing that looks attractive is for me to play the discover check, d6. There's no reason to do that quite yet, though. I can also just play a4. Push that pawn. I'm going to get the c6 square for my king at one point, and he cannot allow the d6 option to remain in the position. There's a lot of power and potential in chess. Many threats are very good, not because of their immediate value, but because of their potential. In this position, d6 is very scary for him to have to deal with. His king does not want to remain on that square, and from d7 it's too far away from my a-pawn. The threat of my a-pawn moving up the board prevents his king from staying on d7, and my d6 move prevents his king from moving to b7, so inevitably my king can come to the c6 square. He played bishop g7, and now I played it, king c6. He played bishop f8. He was worried about my move d6. I played bishop f5 check. And now black has a big problem. If he goes to d8, then he can't defend the queen side. I play a4, a5, a6, etc. He had to go to b8. And now, of course, I brought my king to the king side, king d7. This position is a perfect microcosm of the principle of two weaknesses. Black has two ways to go. Both are bad. Going to the king side is bad because of his queen side weakness. Going to the queen side is bad because of his king side weakness. King b8, king d7. King b7. Now, playing this type of position, it's very important for a strong player to have a basic understanding of the principles, the basic rules of the endgame. I guarantee you, any grandmaster, international master, or master playing this kind of endgame will have thought about the fact that my a-pawn has a queening square which is of the same color as my bishop. And as you've already seen, this would be winning. If I had a dark square bishop on an empty chessboard, my a-pawn wouldn't be sufficient to win against a king that occupies the a8 square. But with a light square bishop, that endgame is winning. What that means is that in this type of position, if I trade off my d-pawn and my g-pawn for his bishop, and I win his two c-pawns, my position is winning. It's very important to have that understood playing this kind of endgame. So now I played king e8. He played bishop h6. I played king f7. He began his counterplay, king b6. g7, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, king c5, and now you see what I was talking about. The fact that the queening square is on a light square is what makes the position winning. If I were to play bishop e4, if I didn't control the queening square, he would have the easy move, c2. After the bishop takes c2, followed by king takes d5, his king could run to the corner, and he'd be able to draw, if it were, say, a dark square bishop now. Draw in position. As it is, my d5 pawn is irrelevant. I don't need it. All that's necessary for the win is the a pawn. I played king f6. King takes d5, which is a good move because it takes the pawn and it also shoulders my king away from it. A lot of the time, a king will keep another king at bay. King g5. And once again, the theme of a useful bishop on a single diagonal comes into play. My plan is for my bishop to go to c2 and my pawn to be defended on the a4 square. That way, with his king on b4, he can't take it, and immediately when he goes to a3, my pawn starts running up the board, and this is winning. He can't stop the pawn. He played king c4, I played bishop c2, he played king b4, and I played a4. Now the win is clear. He played c5, king f4, and he resigned. Why? Because after king a3, the variation is pretty easy. a5, king b2, my bishop moves. c2, of course I sacrifice, bishop takes c2, king takes c2. a6, c4, a7, c3, a8 queen. Now, of course, you remember the theory of king and queen against king. If his pawn was on the 7th rank, and my king were further away, this position would be drawn. Because, as you recall, the idea of keeping his king in front of the pawn in order to bring my king closer would be impossible. His king goes to b2. After I check him, he goes to the corner. And after I bring my queen gradually closer, after check, king a1, queen c3 check, king b1, after queen b3 check, if he had a knight pawn, a queen pawn, or a king pawn, this would be winning because he'd be forced to move in front of the pawn, but as it is, he can go to the corner. And this would be stalemate. There's no way for me to make any progress. A rook pawn is also drawn, but the pawn being on the 6th rank is an easy win. He has no time for that idea, and also, of course, my king is closer. Always when looking at these positions, even a bishop pawn is often winning if the king is close enough because you can checkmate him. Here if he plays king d2, queen d5 check, king c1, I can play king e3. My king is close enough. c2, I have simply king d3, king b1, queen b3 check, king a1. Now, of course, I don't take the pawn because both king takes c2 and queen takes c2 would be stalemate, but I just play queen check. And now once the king moves, I take the pawn with check, and it's winning. So when evaluating queen endgames, you want to keep in mind that if the king is close enough, it can be winning even if it's a rook pawn or a bishop pawn. And the pawn has to be on the 7th rank in order for it to be a draw. And so my opponent resigned in this position. So now returning to the position in which my opponent resigned, remember the variation we just looked at. And if you've already looked at my game against Bonin, you'll recall how small differences can be used. Do you see how my opponent could improve on that variation? Gain 1 tempo? He could use the option c4. Squeeze that move in, because my pawn isn't released until his king comes to the a3 square. If he were to play c4, then after I make the move king e3, then he plays king a3. Now I have two options. One is to play a5, and one is to try to defend with king e2. Point being, after king b2, king d1, I win easily. But after king e2, he could go back to b4, and one could ask, how can I make progress? If I go to e3, he can go back to a3. So let's look at the other variation. After c4, king e3, and then king a3, a5, king b2, bishop moves, c2, I take it, he takes it. I play a6, c3, a7. What we see is that his pawn can get to the 7th rank. He can play king b2, then I make a queen, then he plays c2. But what's the critical difference? My king is close enough. Always look for these differences. I just play queen b7 check. If he goes in front of the pawn, then of course, this move is winning. And if he moves away from the pawn, I don't have to use the queen. My king just comes to d2, stopping him from queening, and next I take it. So if he were to try to gain a little bit of time in order to get his pawn to the 7th rank, my king would get close enough to defend. My opponent resigned. So this endgame probably began in a drawn position. But what I was able to do is make him defend over a long time. He got tired. He had a lot of issues to deal with. I balanced my kingside passed pawn with the potential of a queenside passed pawn. I had a threat of c5, and he couldn't hold the weakness of the c7 square and the a5 square on the queen side. Because, of course, if you think back on it, on the queen side he had to deal with the principle of two weaknesses as well, the a5 square and the c7 square. So when you're trying to win an endgame with bishops of opposite color, create as many problems for your opponent as possible. But also, if you have the option to avoid bishops of opposite color endgame, when you're up material, do it, because these endgames are very drawish. This game was played in the U.S. Class Championship in 1995. My opponent is a very strong grandmaster named Alexander Yermolinsky, and he's a fantastic endgame player, very, very hard to beat. In fact, I've played a number of better endgames against him, and I only managed to win this one. Let's take a look at it. Here, it's even material. We're going to focus on the position in a few moves, but I want to show you the transition into the endgame. Here I have two bishops. I have a queenside majority, which is obviously going to prove useful in the endgame. He's threatening to play the move f5, maybe. Often when you have two bishops, you want to maintain them, because they can be very strong against two knights, or against bishop and knight. But here I played an unusual move. It may seem like the most obvious move to one kind of player, but to another player it seems like the most difficult kind of move. The relationship between bishop and knight in this position is that I can take his knight whenever I want to, and he can't do anything about it. For that reason, logically, there's no reason for me to take it, because I can maintain that tension. It's to my advantage. But in this position, precisely, bishop takes d6 wins a pawn. Bishop takes d6. Now, if he plays knight takes d6, then he has a big problem, because after the move c3, his rook can't defend the c3 pawn and defend his knight. After b takes c3, b takes c3. If he plays rook c2, I play rook takes d6, which is, by the way, defending my knight from his bishop, and I win a piece. And if he plays rook d1, then I just play c2, and he has to play rook c1 now, and then I win his knight, rook takes d6. If he takes with the rook, then I also win by force. I play rook takes d6, knight takes d6, c3, b takes c3, b takes c3, king e1, knight b4. My pawn is very, very hard to defend. I'm threatening his a2 pawn. If he moves it, then I play knight c2 check. And then if he plays king d1, knight e3 check will win a piece. And if he goes to f2, then my c3 pawn will be impossible to stop. His only move here would have been to play king d1, after which I play bishop takes a2, and once again we see two weaknesses, and my a6 and c3 pawns will be impossible to stop. So it's strange. We see that after bishop takes d6, he can't recapture my bishop either way. Both rook takes d6 and knight takes d6 are impossible. And you know, it might be hard to understand how a grandmaster, a very strong grandmaster like Yermolinsky, could miss a move like bishop takes d6, while a master might not have missed the move at all. The reason is because of his class. There are certain moves which grandmasters intuitively look past because they're unnatural. In this type of position, all the instincts of a strong player say that black should not take the knight, because the bishop on e7 is very strong, and it's a tension which is to my advantage. His last move was king f1, which was a big mistake. He overlooked the move because it was unnatural. Bishop takes d6 then. He had to play the move f5. He doesn't lose a piece, but he does lose a pawn. So now if I were to go back, bishop c8, then after rook takes d6, knight takes d6, he wouldn't be attacking a2 pawn after c3, and the position would be more easy to defend. After f5, I played bishop e5. And here he played f takes e6, f takes e6, rook takes d8, knight takes d8. And here we have the endgame. Once again we notice that there are bishops of opposite color. As we saw in the last game against Moscow, it's very hard to win those types of endgames. The knights are important for me. I want to keep the knights on the board. There's no reason for me to allow him to reach a drawish endgame. And so the technique that I used here is quite similar to the one I used in the last game. I want to create weaknesses. First of all, His pawn on b2 is hanging, and he has to do something about it. He played b3. If he were to play knight d2, I could play c3 and get the passed pawn that way. After b3, I played c3, a protected passed pawn. Now this change is to my advantage in that I have a protected passed pawn now on c3, and it's to his advantage in that he's locked my pawns on the same color as my bishop, and he can create a light square blockade. His king on c2 or bishop on c2 will be very hard to dislodge. Now, create a plan for black. What should I do? Let's look at this position logically. First of all, I'm up a pawn. I'm obviously much better. But how do I make progress? His knight on e4 is very strong. His bishop on that diagonal will also be very strong. But it should be noticed that both his bishop and his knight are optimally placed on the same diagonal. They're a little redundant. That's to my advantage. Also, his knight on e4 is very important to guard his dark squares. Potentially, my king wants to come in to the king side, the g5 and h4 squares. His king will be necessary to defend on the queen side. His king will probably defend on c2. That understood, I should create weaknesses on the king side, exploit that side of the board. And so it becomes clear that I'm going to use the queen side as a way to lull his defenses that way, and then I'll try to take advantage of weaknesses that I've created on the king side. That's the plan. Also, of course, it's good for me to create an active knight. Moves like knight c6 to d4 come into mind. Maybe I can get my knight to the f4 square, to the e3 square. He has dark square holes. He has control of the light squares, I have control of the dark squares. Both of us have pluses and minuses. Now it's time to create some weaknesses and try to get in there. He played king e1. My first move, as usual, was to bring my king in, king f7. He played king d1. He can't really bring his bishop to the defense of the queen side, because to do that he has to move his knight, and once he moves his knight, he releases my king to enter his king side. After king d1, I played the important move, king g6. This ties his knight down to the e4 square, and also indirectly paralyzes his bishop. His knight can't move because of king g5 to h4, and his bishop can't move because the knight blocks it in. My king on g6 makes both his knight on e4 and his bishop on g2 passive. Very important. He played bishop f3. His weakness of the g5 square is hard to deal with, and he might be preparing the move h4. But that's what I want him to do. I want him to push his pawns. I want to make them weak. After bishop f3, I played a5. Potentially, he could play knight c5 and attack the pawn, defending my b4 pawn, getting my pawn off a light square. A detail again, improving my position. And now he played the move h4. He saw my plan. My next few moves were going to be knight c6 to d4. Notice that when my pawn was on h6, if I played knight c6, he would play knight c5, attacking both my knight on c6 and my pawn on a6. Now that he has no good discoveries on my knight, I want to do that. He played h4. A weakness. Now my king has done its work. My king being on g6 provoked the weakness. Now I can go elsewhere. King f7. Patience. The conversion of my advantage in this endgame is all about understatement. Everything I do is indirect. I played king g6 just to have the potential of breaking through on the king's side. I enticed the h-pawn up the board. Then I went back. No problem. Now my king will look for other work. He played king c2. King e7. He played knight c5. My threat was knight c6. I wanted to come into the d4 square. Notice, of course, that last move it would have been a big mistake to play knight c6. Knight c6, he has the move knight d6 check. After I take it, bishop takes c6, and he's reached a bishop of opposite color endgame. Very drawish. I don't want to allow that. If we think about an optimal setup for him, put his pawn on h5 and his bishop on f3, his king on d3. Very, very hard to make progress here. Maybe I can, maybe not. But the key is for me to keep all of my options open. There's no reason for me to allow this trade. I played king e7. He played knight c5. He needs to release his bishop from the king side. Now that his knight is moved, I can do what I wanted. I played the move bishop g3. Attacking the weak h4 pawn, he has to push it up the board, and now he has further weaknesses on the king side. So notice, I brought my king to g6 to provoke h4, then I took my king away. Then he moved his knight away, and then I played bishop g3. This is an endgame of understatement, of feints. Now he's forced to play h5, and he has a weak g5 square, a hole that I'll take advantage of later. I played knight f7, going for the squares that he's weakened. Now my knight can come to g5 and e5. If he plays knight b7 attacking my a5 pawn, I can just go back with bishop c7 and defend it, no problem. He played e3. His point is that he saw that if I trade knight for bishop, I'll be winning. My threat was knight e5, and whenever I want to, I can play knight takes f3. His king will be stuck defending the c3 pawn, and my king can enter the dark squares. Big trouble for him. Now notice, for example, that if we made the trade, knight takes f3, e takes f3, and my king were to come to the f4 square, I'd be attacking the base of his pawn chain, the f3 pawn, and the only way to defend it would be with the knight from a dark square. The only way for a knight to defend a light square is from a dark square. And by definition, with the knight on d4, defending a light square, my bishop can attack it on a dark square. And this is part of the advantage of bishop and king against knight and king. The knight can't defend its weaknesses, because if the pawns are all on the same color of the bishop, then the bishop can attack the pawns. If the knight is defending the pawns, then the bishop can attack the knight. The knight can't do all of its work from the opposite color of the bishop. Compare this, for example, to if there were a white bishop on e4 instead of a knight. This position would be easily drawn, because the bishop can defend the pawns from the same color of the pawns, and my bishop can't do anything. Now he can just go back and forth for the whole game. Easy draw. So I played knight f7, knight e5. Again, this is more about potential than it's about realization. If I play knight e5, I'm not necessarily going to take the bishop. I might just want to move my bishop off the forking square, e4, and then I can try to either bring my king to f6 and g5. Maybe I can move my knight to g5 and bring my king to e5. I can trade, but I can also just have the potential for the trade. Who's to say what I'll really do? I want to keep my opponent dealing with a lot of problems. After knight f7, e3, I played bishop f2. He's created a new weakness. Naturally, I want to attack it. He can't play e4 because I'll take the knight on c5. If he plays king d3, I have knight e5 check. And now he's in trouble. After king e2, c2, I win a piece because there's no way for him to defend everything. If he moves his king over to d2, defending the queening square, I can play knight takes f3, I've won a piece. And if he plays knight d3, defending the queening square, I just play knight takes d3, and next I make a queen. His king would be overloaded on d3. It's stuck to pure defense in the c2 square, and once again we see the value of an active king. I've kept his king by my pawn on c3 defending, and my king is provoking weaknesses everywhere, and eventually it will enter. After bishop f2, he played knight b7, attacking my a5 pawn. I played knight e5, attacking his bishop. He had to go back with bishop d1. I played bishop takes e3. Knight takes a5. Black to move. What would you do? So now the key trade has taken place. I've taken off his e3 pawn for my a5 pawn. The a5 pawn was kind of irrelevant, and now I have the second weakness. My e6 pawn is a passer. He has to deal with both c3 and e6, and with the weakness on g4. I play the simple move, bishop c5. And here the decentralization of his knight becomes very obvious. He has two possibilities to try to bring it back into the game. Obviously his king can't really move, and his bishop is stuck defending the g4 pawn. My next two moves will be king f6 to g5, followed by knight takes g4. He's in trouble. If he plays the move knight b7, trying to get in that way, obviously I cover the c6 square with my knight. After knight b7, bishop b6, he can resign the game because his knight is trapped. There's nowhere to go. I cover a5 and c5 with my bishop d6 and d8 are covered by the king. My next two moves will be king d7 to c7. He can't defend with bishop f3 because my knight guards that square. I'll just take the knight and win. If he tries the desperate idea of bishop e2, king c7, bishop a6 to defend the knight from that square, and in truth that's the only way he can hope to do it. Then his pieces are tied down ridiculously. My next two moves will just simply be knight g4, knight e3 check, or maybe even knight g4, knight f6, and then take the h5 pawn. He can't do anything. His pieces are terrible, and I win the game. His only other option with the knight would be to play knight c4, offering a trade into a bishop opposite color endgame, and this is one time that I would accept the trade. Now I could play knight c6, followed by knight d4 check and win, but the best move is the simplest move. Knight takes c4, b takes c4, and now because of the two weaknesses, or potentially three weaknesses if you include the g4 pawn, the position is impossible to defend. I just play king f6, king d3, king e5. My next move will be king f4, and he can't stop it because I guard the e3 square, so he has to play passive moves, say king back to c2. Then I play king f4. He has to waste time, king d3, I would play e5, king c2, e4. Now I guard the d3 and d2 squares. Say he tries a move like bishop e2. Then I would just play king e3, attacking the bishop. If he defends with king d1, then c2 check forces the king off of the bishop and I win a piece. He has to go back to d1. Then I play king f2. He has absolutely no play. My next two moves will be e3 and e2. I win a piece and win the game. The bishop endgame would be very easily winning. So if he were to play knight c4, I would accept this offer to trade into a bishop of opposite color endgame because I would see that it was very easily winning. The last option which he would have is to try desperately to create some counterplay by the move a4, creating a passed pawn. But this too would lose. My response would be b takes a3 en passant, and after king takes c3, do you see the move? Take your time and find the right tactic. I would just play bishop d4 check. I force the queening of my pawn. If the king moves back to c2, then I play a2, and I guard the b2 square. The pawn guards the b1 square. He can't stop me from queening. And if he accepts the sacrifice, king takes d4. Then after a2, there's no way to stop the pawn, and I win. So returning to this position, the only three options he had were a4, knight c4, and knight b7. They all lose. He saw that, and he resigned. So if you go back and think about this endgame, I won with understatement. A big part of endgame technique is provoking your opponent in the course of his defense to create new problems for himself. That was how I won this game.